First thing, thank you for inviting me. I am sad to be here virtually. I was in Hangzhou in person in, I think, 2016 with Yu Kui and Matthew Fuller, and I was very honored to visit, and I hope to visit in person. So I'm Harry Halpin. If you have any questions, you may email me. And this is the talk about, I'm going to try to give some philosophical background to the talk of Frank Braun and Smuggler and Pavlov. So obviously there's been no more world-defining event in 2020 other than the pandemic and the wave of digitization it has created. So a moment of philosophical and historical reflection is in order so we can understand what is at stake in this digital totality we have entered, which is a term that Pavlov put forward in his hackers conference in Prague this year. The cypherpunks, people like Frank Braun and Smuggler, but put forward as a group of dissident technologists in the United States in the 1990s, they foresaw that a digital totality would envelop the world, and this would lead to a method of what I call a society of hypercontrol, following the lead of Georg Agamben. So it should be remembered that in English, the term pandemic descends from a usage in Latin and then Greek pandemos, which simply means belonging to the people, all of the people. And this plague, this term for a plague, which belongs to everyone, is shared with everyone, actually shares the same root term in Greek as demos, and thus democracy. And so by its very universal nature, a pandemic has a resonance with empire, but not just any empire, for example, such as the Chinese empire in the ancient times, but particularly it belongs to global empires that want to envelop the entire world. And this concept of a universal empire descends not from ancient Greece, which was city-states, not an empire, but from Persia, from Alexander the Great's first attempt at a universal empire, and finally the Roman Empire. And thus, an empire is the concept of global governance, which no one can escape, and controls life, and is at the heart of the nation state in the West. And this universalism is thus at the heart of the United States, which has been the military force enforcing global capital since the end of the Second World War. And such a question is, can a new world global governance be maintained? So not only is pandemos at the heart of democracy in ancient Greece, but should be remembered that pandemics appear at the end of empire. The Antonine Plague killed a quarter of the population of Rome, and furthermore, it decimated the Roman Empire and the army itself. Weakened, the Roman army tried to replenish its soldiers, but it was already an empty shell of its former self due to the deaths caused by the pandemic, and so the army fell apart. And who can argue that the American empire itself is not falling apart due to COVID-19, due to the plague? And thus, with the advent of COVID, the inevitable collapse of the American empire seems assured. Yet any future horizon is closed. And what is at stake in Trump and the failure of the West and the United States to control the pandemic is not just the discredit of an empire as a domain of cultural and psychological and biological control, but it's the threat that the American military no longer seems to be a credible threat to the world, just as the Roman army was no longer a credible threat. This is a map of all the United States Army bases showing that the US is indeed a global empire in a military sense. However, what comes after the end of a global empire? And we can learn from what happened after the pandemics and the fall of the Roman Empire. As the physical power of the Roman Empire disappeared, the principle of spiritual power remained in the Catholic Church. There were no longer physical methods of control, but forms of life were strictly psychologically controlled by the development of Christianity. After the fall of the empire, this empire of a mind which lasted 1,000 years, it actually continued and paralyzed any kind of forward technological progress in the West until the advent of printing led to what we call the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And I would like to make a parallel that the internet is a universal project, a project to interconnect all the networks of the world. This is a map of all the internet exchange points. And that the internet as a power, just like the church, will remain after the end of the American Empire. And that's why as America ends, we see a strange fascination with the internet as a tool of mind control by media platforms in the United States, such as Facebook and Twitter. Somehow maybe a tool of Russia to support Trump with fake news, or somehow that artificial intelligence is actually control of our minds. And this may seem ridiculous, but it contains a hidden truth that we no longer understand the internet via the classical paradigm of liberal individual, and the internet is precisely how psychological order remains after the collapse, the military collapse of empire. And so what I would like to discuss is how the empire transforms into a spiritual force. And to do this, we have to go back to the origin of the internet via the thinking of MIT's J.C.R. Licklider. To understand the internet's philosophical foundations, one should revisit Norbert Wiener, the original thinker of cybernetics, or as he called it, control and communication in the animal and machine. And the key concept of cybernetics is that systems reach a state of stasis, homeostasis, not civil war, but stability, where internal state is stable due to feedback. And this comes from Kubernetes in Greek, which is similar to pandemic, or pandemos means that which belongs to govern it. But in his original book, Norbert Wiener, which very few people read this book, claimed that we should not use cybernetics to control human beings. The human beings are too unpredictable and that it was unethical. And he wrote a follow-up book called The Human Use of Human Beings, decrying this usage. But as the Second World War ended and Europe laid in ruins, government officials saw that democracy itself had lost its appeal to fascism. And so they decided that they needed a new paradigm to stabilize the population. That was cybernetics. And Wiener's cybernetics was given a technological form by his previous protege, Licklider, and his assistant, Taylor, and the invention of the internet by the United States government's Advanced Research Project Agency, ARPA, where they theorized that computers should be not just calculators to calculate numbers, but communication devices. And this is the original illustrations from their book. And you can see that most of this has come true. And there was another parallel strain of development, which was the development of artificial intelligence. The earliest machine learning system was put forward by Oliver Selfridge in 1959 at the inaugural conference of artificial intelligence by McCarthy and Minsky. And the theory was, rather than to replicate human intelligence, we would basically have many small programs called daemons, which could each do a limited, well-defined task. And this was influenced by the understanding from neuroscience of how cells in our very eyes can recognize patterns like edges and feed the results to higher and higher levels. And this led to the development of artificial intelligence, where we have a multitude of algorithms that control data and make opaque decisions. And the architecture, as this was called, interestingly enough, pandemonium, with the city of demons, as illustrated here. And with the spread of the internet, more and more of our human activity is transformed into bits that can be fed to this new pandemonium of artificial intelligence, which then uses algorithms to modulate and control society via cybernetic feedback. Philosophy has long ignored technology. just as theoretical knowledge, as shown in this conference's title, ignores practical knowledge. And so for 30 years, philosophy ignored the internet. But towards the end of his life, Gilles Deleuze wrote the postscript on societies of control, where he noted that in contrast to what Foucault theorized as disciplinary societies, the world we were entering where we had societies of control, where what is important is no longer a signature, a number, but a code, a password, and the numerical language of control is made of codes that mark the access to information or reject it. And individuals are no longer individuals, but as Deleuze phrases it, dividuals, masses of samples, data, markets, or banks. And this was a transition outside of the previous form of life in the West. And therefore, and as after Auschwitz and Hiroshima, the way to think about it is that cybernetics allows Europe and the United States to continue, although no one believed in human reason due to these massacres and crimes, but continue via calculation. So as our friend and mentor Bernard Stiegler said, due to the shock of the digital, the internet's not just a form of communication, but transforms our very process of individuation, of becoming individuals. And the goal is to create a form of governments that would be impossible to be disturbed. And what Heidegger terms as calculation becomes universal, so that a certain metaphysical halting of the future would be obtained, and that there would be no possible future horizon. And this was theorized by his best student, Rainer Sherman, that the cybernetic machine could hold global society together in terms of homeostasis, even if there was no metaphysical principle left and no one believed in the West. As was asked by Der Spiegel in his last interview, which was published after his death, they asked him, what takes the place of philosophy in the 21st century? And Heidegger said, cybernetics. At a seminar in Venice, I confronted Giorgio Agamben about these issues of control and cybernetics on the internet, discussing Snowden with him. And Agamben said that society had transformed beyond what even Deleuze had considered into a society of hypercontrol, where all of our social life was going to become part of a digital totality, and so subject to continuous surveillance and feedback. And this is obviously self-evident after the coronavirus pandemic, that every part of life, governments, universities, are now more easily monitored and controlled. But Agamben said something very interesting. He said that although resistance may seem impossible because it just increases control, that at the end of the Roman Empire, it was not the worst people, it was not the mentally deficient people and the useless people that left formed monasteries, but it was the best people, the most intelligent people produced by Rome. And thus, Agamben suggests the best form of action was to flee and to create a new form of society without the internet or computers. And his students tried this, the Invisible Committee, Tikkun, and they failed because just by virtue of cutting off their mobile phones and internet access, the government believed they were terrorists and tracked them down in the mountains of France. But in their book, À nos amis, or To Our Friends, the students of Agamben pointed out that there is a distinction between technology, which is a system of social control that's based on seizing our mental powers and using them against us to make us subservient to a larger system, to proletarize us, as Stiegler would say, which leads to the loss of our artisanal skills, our know-how, our savoir-faire, and makes us part of a larger machine. And technique, which is simply any method that extends human capabilities, tools, swords, computers, because we, as humans, as hairless apes, are ultimately always have, as Stiegler put it, a default. And to return to Stiegler, who always remarked very fondly upon his time in China, Stiegler said, could we repurpose these techniques to create a new digital world without control? Is there possible that we could create, he wanted to reinvent the internet and work with computer programmers like myself to understand it, to create new kinds of computational techniques, to reverse the process of proletarialization that had created, as Deleuze put it, these isolated individuals, and instead create new forms of individuals in a new form of society. And his grand theory, which we can only remark upon very briefly, was that the internet was not only transforming our communications between each other, but was a revolution on the scope of human language itself. And thus it had fractured the connection between generations, but we could restore that connection, the short circuiting via technology. And Bernard's final conversation with me is that he, last February, before he died, he discussed the possible promises of blockchain technology to go beyond financial speculation and create a new form of decentralized society, which Bernard, following Mauss, called the Internation. And I will claim that Bitcoin could be such a technique to create a new kind of technology and to disrupt the cybernetic church of the American and Silicon Valley empire. As it, the crypto anarchists essentially believe that cryptography could provide ways to guard humanity against control and enable a new world based on human freedom. And at the end of the financial crisis, with the appearance of 2008 of Bitcoin's peer-to-peer eCash paper, it seemed as if a new alien technology had just appeared upon Earth with a possible different metaphysical orientation to cybernetics. That Bitcoin combines techniques like proof of work, digital cash from the cypherpunks, and it combined them in a new way, and thus led to a kind of new sort of uncensorable money of the internet. And this new form is just only one example of the revolution of the crypto-anarchist cypherpunks. The next part is what I'm working on, what we call mixed nets, originally proposed by David Chaum. Mixed nets had the goal to make surveillance by even the National Security Agency of the United States impossible by randomly mixing packets and delinking messages so no one could tell who was communicating to who. If you're interested in this, please email us, and we have a WeChat channel and Telegram group, and we're working on programming it now. So my thesis is that the crypto anarchists, a small marginal movement, are able to turn the tools of cybernetics against hypercontrol and so create a new society without control. And even this is further illustration of a mixed net, but even though blockchain technologies provide not just an alternative financial infrastructure, but a technical successor to the political domination of Silicon Valley and the American empire. And although crypto anarchism does not have many scholarly or academic books, does not have much in the way of academic philosophical analysis, crypto anarchism is the only genuine new philosophical movement of the 21st century, and therefore deserves your careful attention. And although it's clear that digital technology can be used for control, what is less obvious that techniques can be used against control to open up the future rather than to foreclose it. So I believe there will be a civil war within computer technology that to take the power of algorithms and cryptography away from Silicon Valley and put them into the hands of the people, similar to how the church faced the war over its control of writing and reading when the Reformation and the invention of the printing press were done in Europe. And this was a huge war which killed many thousands, a third of the population in some cities, just like a plague. But within a generation, groups which put the power of reading and writing into the hands of ordinary people ended the spiritual domination of the church in Europe and led to a technological revolution, which led to the dominance of Europe globally under colonialism and the Industrial Revolution, and eventually the invention of the computer. So could we imagine a new universe, a contemporary parallel, where cypherpunks put the power of computer programming into the hands of people? And what would this mean for global politics? And there's a strange moment in history where just as something is the most powerful, it collapses. And the attempts by crypto anarchists to bind the digital via the shackles of cryptography create that open horizon, and it could be a way forward in a world without a new empire, but just create a world without a guiding principle, as Derrida or Sherman would say in Arsh, and so create a way out of the cybernetic pandemonium that we live in today and the pandemic. It may be the only way to create anarchy, a world without predefined principles, and a world where every culture and people can finally take their destiny into their own hands. And this is, I believe, the meaning of crypto anarchy. But there are two questions that remain, and these I will leave to you. The first question is, are crypto anarchists, which are a small minority movement, can these techniques of cryptography be used as revolutionary techniques, not just for a small group of people, but for all people? And finally, just as the pandemics adhere to all people, we need these techniques for everyone, not just the technical elite. But as the United States is on the verge of civil war, with the conflict between Trump and Biden, and just as we see the global financial system now facing a new crisis, European metaphysics being in a state of paranoia, the true question is, what does the crypto-anarchist moment mean for China, which is the other great axis of human civilization? And this is the question that I would like for you to answer. That's it.